Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm 42 years old, and I never thought a gift meant to bring my family closer would show me exactly where I stood. I paid for an ultra-luxury cruise for my parents, and they took my lazy brother instead. When they came back, everything changed quietly, permanently. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories about family drama, emotional courage, and standing your ground. I didn't buy that cruise because I had extra money or because I wanted praise. I bought it because I was tired of carrying old feelings that never seemed to fade, no matter how much time passed. I told myself it was time to do something kind, something big enough to smooth over years of small hurts. My parents were getting older. I worried about time. I worried about regret. I wanted peace more than fairness, and I thought a generous gift might finally bring that. For most of my life, I had been the dependable one, the daughter who showed up early and stayed late, the one who remembered birthdays, paid bills on time, and answered calls no matter how busy I was. My parents leaned on that without meaning to. Or maybe they did mean to and I just didn't want to see it. Either way, I became the safe choice. Reliable, predictable, easy to overlook. My brother Mark was the opposite. He was always between jobs, always figuring things out. He had charm, I'll give him that. He could make my mother laugh when she was worried. He could promise change in a way that sounded sincere, even when nothing followed. My parents worried about him out loud. About me, they stayed quiet. I think they assumed I'd be fine no matter what. The idea for the cruise came to me late one night while I was paying bills at my kitchen table. My mother had called earlier, stressed about my father's health and how they never got to enjoy themselves anymore. I sat there staring at numbers and thought, maybe this is it. Maybe this is how I finally do something that brings us all to the same place emotionally. Not fixing things exactly, just softening them. I researched quietly. I didn't tell anyone at first. I looked for something special but not flashy. Comfortable, well-organized, safe. The kind of trip older couples actually enjoy. I imagined my parents sitting on a deck, watching the water, talking without stress. In my mind, I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. I just wanted to know they felt cared for. When I finally told them, my mother gasped. She put her hand to her chest like she always did when she was overwhelmed. My father cleared his throat and asked practical questions. Dates, insurance, details. Neither of them asked why I was doing it. They just accepted it, and I told myself that was okay. Gratitude doesn't always look the same, I said to myself. That night, though, I lay awake thinking about other times I tried to bridge gaps with effort. Hosting holidays alone. Driving hours for short visits. Offering help before it was asked for. I wondered if this cruise was another one of those moments. I pushed the thought away. This was different. This was generous. This was clean. No strings. A week later, my mother called again. She sounded excited, almost nervous. She talked about packing lists and weather and how my father needed new walking shoes. Then she casually mentioned Mark had been around more lately. Helping out. Being thoughtful. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was used to hearing about his good phases. I transferred the final payment the next morning. As soon as the confirmation email came through, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that I'd done something meaningful. Sadness because part of me hoped this would finally balance something that had been uneven for decades. I didn't expect miracles. Just acknowledgement. A few days before the trip, my father stopped by to pick up paperwork I'd printed. He hugged me, quick and awkward. He said, "This really means a lot." I held on to that sentence longer than I should have. I replayed it while washing dishes, while folding laundry. It felt like proof that I mattered. I should have noticed what wasn't said. No mention of going together. No mention of how proud they were. Just gratitude floating on the surface, untethered from anything deeper. Still, I ignored the warning signs. I wanted this gift to stand on its own, untouched by old patterns. On the morning they left, I sent a simple text. "Have a wonderful time." My mother replied with a heart emoji. That was it. I sat on my couch with a cup of coffee, imagining them at the port. I didn't know yet that this gift, meant to heal old wounds, was already pulling them open again. I didn't find out all at once. There was no dramatic phone call or raised voices. It came quietly, slipping into my day the way uncomfortable truths usually do. I was standing at my kitchen sink, rinsing a coffee mug, when my phone buzzed on the counter. A message preview lit up the screen, just a few words, enough to make my hands go still. It was from my Aunt Linda. She wrote, "Your mom just posted a picture from the ship. Looks like Mark made it after all." For a moment I honestly thought she was mistaken. I dried my hands slowly, picked up the phone and opened the message. There was another one underneath. "I thought you were going to?" I didn't reply. I opened social media instead, my heart tapping against my ribs in a dull, uneven way. The picture was there. My parents on a bright deck, sun behind them, my father squinting into the light. And between them, smiling wide, was my brother. I sat down hard at the kitchen table. The chair scraped louder than usual, and I noticed that sound before I noticed the feeling. That's how it often happens with me. Sensations first, emotions later. I stared at the photo, studying details like they might explain themselves. Mark was wearing a new jacket, the kind he never bought for himself. My mother's hand rested on his arm, familiar and easy. They looked like a complete picture. Like this was always the plan. I scrolled through the comments. Family friends wishing them well. Little jokes. Heart emojis. Someone wrote, "So nice the whole family could go." I felt something tighten in my chest, not sharp, just heavy. I realized then that no one had questioned my absence. Not one person wondered where I was. That stung more than seeing Mark there. I set the phone face down and sat in the quiet. The house felt larger than it had that morning. Too much space. Too much air. I replayed my last conversation with my mother, her voice light and busy, mentioning Mark helping out lately. I heard it differently now. Not as a passing comment, but as preparation. As a soft way of easing him into a place that was never meant for me. I didn't cry right away. I made myself lunch. Soup from a can. I ate standing up, leaning against the counter because sitting felt like giving in to something. I kept thinking there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe Mark paid his way. Maybe it was a last-minute decision. Maybe they assumed I wouldn't want to go. I clung to those maybes like they were facts. That afternoon my phone rang. My mother's name lit up the screen. I answered after the third ring. Her voice was cheerful, almost rushed, like she was walking and talking at the same time. She told me the ship was beautiful. The weather was perfect. Then she said, "Oh, and Mark sends his love. He surprised us and met us here." I waited for more. For an apology. For hesitation. For anything that suggested she understood how this might sound. Nothing came. I asked quietly, "You took Mark?" There was a pause, just a breath. She said, "Well, he really needed this, Sarah. You know how things have been for him." I looked out the window at my small backyard. The grass needed cutting. A bird hopped along the fence. Normal things. I said, "I see." My voice sounded steady even to me. She talked a bit more, filling the space, then said she'd call later. When the line went dead, I noticed my hand was shaking. I thought about all the times I'd needed something and told myself I didn't. Times I swallowed disappointment because someone else had it worse. I remembered my promotion years ago, how my parents nodded politely before turning the conversation back to Mark's latest plan. I remembered lending him money I never got back. Covering for him. Explaining him. Each memory lined up neatly like pieces I'd refused to assemble. That evening I took a walk around the block. The sun was low, the air cooler. Neighbors waved. Someone asked how my folks were doing. I smiled and said they were on vacation. I didn't add anything else. I realized I'd been doing that my whole life. Editing myself to make things sound better than they were. At home, I sat with a notebook I hadn't opened in years. I didn't write at first. I just held the pen and listened to the quiet. Then I started listing moments. Not dramatic ones. Small choices. Missed calls. Canceled plans. The way my parents' worry always flowed downhill toward Mark, never sideways toward me. Seeing it written down made it real in a way feelings alone never had. Late that night my father called. He asked if everything was okay. I told him I'd seen the picture. There was a long silence. He said, "We didn't think you'd mind." That sentence landed harder than anything else. Not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. They hadn't thought about me at all. After we hung up, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I didn't feel angry the way I expected. I felt clear. Clear about where I stood. clear about how long I'd been standing there. The realization wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, settled. I was never the first choice. I was the backup plan, the safe option, the one who would understand. And for the first time, instead of trying to change that, I let myself fully see it. The morning after that realization, I woke up earlier than usual. Not from worry or habit, but because my mind felt strangely quiet. No running list of things to fix. No planning how to smooth things over. Just stillness. I made coffee and sat at the table watching steam rise from the mug. It felt like standing in a room after furniture had been cleared out. Empty but honest. I didn't rush to call anyone. I didn't explain. I didn't ask questions I already knew the answers to. I let the silence stay. That was new for me. Usually silence made me uneasy. This time it felt earned. Later that morning, I opened a folder on my laptop labeled Family. Inside were documents I'd collected over the years. Insurance forms. Emergency contacts. Notes about medications. Things my parents trusted me to keep track of. I scrolled through them slowly. Each file reminded me of how deeply involved I'd made myself in their lives, often without being asked. I closed the folder and didn't reopen it. I drove to the bank just before lunch. The parking lot was half full, the kind of weekday calm I usually liked. Inside, the air smelled faintly of carpet cleaner. I sat with a young teller who spoke gently and followed my instructions without comment. I changed access on an account I'd helped manage for years. Nothing dramatic. Just a quiet adjustment that reflected reality instead of habit. On the way home, I stopped at the grocery store. I wandered aisles without a list, noticing things I'd skipped for years because someone else didn't like them. I bought bread with seeds, soup with spices, a small bouquet of yellow flowers that reminded me of my grandmother. I placed them on the table when I got home and smiled at how bright they looked against the plain room. That afternoon, my neighbor Carol knocked on the door. She held a package that had been delivered to her by mistake. We chatted on the porch. She asked how my parents were enjoying their trip. I told her they'd made it safely. She said that was good and changed the subject. No drama. No pity. Just normal conversation. I realized how little I'd needed to say. Over the next few days, I began noticing how much time I'd spent managing emotions that weren't mine. Every phone call, every visit carried a quiet weight. I was always adjusting my tone, my words, my expectations. Without those calls, my days felt longer. Not lonely. Spacious. One evening, Mark texted me. Just a photo of a drink with a paper umbrella. No message. I stared at it for a moment, then put the phone down. I didn't respond. My heart beat faster than settled. I realized how often I'd been pulled into his life without invitation or respect. Not this time. I took out a notebook again, but instead of listing old hurts, I wrote about what I wanted my days to look like. Simple things. Morning walks. Quiet dinners. Time spent on hobbies I'd abandoned because they didn't fit into anyone else's schedule. Writing felt easier now, less tangled with guilt. Midweek, my mother called. I watched the phone ring until it stopped. I felt a flicker of panic, then relief. When she left a message, her voice sounded tired. She talked about the weather. About a show they'd seen on board. She didn't mention Mark. She didn't ask how I was. I didn't call back. I spent that afternoon cleaning out a closet. Old boxes, old papers. Things I'd held onto out of obligation rather than need. I threw away cards that said, "Thanks for understanding," without ever acknowledging what I'd understood. Each item felt like letting go of a role I no longer wanted to play. On Friday, I met my friend Joanne for lunch. We'd known each other since our kids were small. She noticed right away that something was different. "You look lighter," she said. I laughed, surprised. I told her a little, not everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded and said, "About time." That made me smile. That weekend, I rearranged my living room. Nothing expensive. Just moving furniture so the space worked better for me. I put my favorite chair by the window. I stacked books I'd been meaning to read. I felt a quiet pride in choosing comfort without needing permission. One night, I dreamed I was standing at a train station, holding a ticket I'd never used. I watched trains come and go. When I woke up, I knew what it meant. I'd been waiting for approval that was never coming. The dream didn't upset me. Clarified something. A few days later, my father called again. I answered this time. He sounded hesitant. He asked if I was upset. I told him I was thinking. There was a pause. He said, "We'll talk when we get back." I didn't promise anything. I noticed how my body responded to that conversation. No tight chest. No racing thoughts. Just a steady calm. I took a walk afterward, feeling the sun on my face, the pavement solid beneath my shoes. I realized I was standing on my own ground for the first time in years. I cooked dinner that night and ate slowly, savoring flavors instead of rushing. I thought about how often I'd eaten quickly, ready to jump up if someone called. No one called. The quiet stayed. As the days passed, I stopped checking social media. I didn't want updates. I didn't need proof. I already knew what mattered. My life felt smaller in some ways but stronger. Like a house with fewer rooms but sturdier walls. The night before they were due to return, I sat on the couch with a blanket and turned off the lights. I listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic. I didn't rehearse conversations. I didn't plan explanations. I let the moment be what it was. While they were gone, I didn't become someone new. I became someone clearer. I learned what it felt like to stop reaching and start standing. And once I felt that difference, I knew there was no going back. The day they came back, I felt it in my chest before I even heard the car pull up the driveway. The familiar crunch of tires on gravel sounded different somehow. Too loud, too confident, like it belonged to people who expected the world to pause for them. I was sitting at the kitchen table sipping tea, the morning light spilling across the counter, when I heard the front door open. My mother's voice came first, high-pitched, cheerful. "Sarah, we're home." It carried the same excitement she always had after vacations, the kind that made you feel small even when they weren't looking at you. Then my father's footsteps followed, slower, heavier. They both laughed at something, maybe a joke Mark had made. I stayed still, quiet, listening. I could hear them in the hallway before they entered the living room. My mother calling, "Did you see the dolphin show? Oh, and Sarah, the sunset was gorgeous, you would have loved it." My father grumbling softly about the heat on the deck. And then their pause at the threshold. I could feel the shift, though I didn't move. They expected smiles, chatter, the usual warmth I had supplied for decades. They stepped in, luggage in tow. The smell of suntan lotion and sea air came with them. A scent that always made me think of family trips when I was younger. But this wasn't a trip I had taken. Mark's presence was obvious even before I saw him. The suitcase he carried, the way my father handed him a bag with a gentle nod, like he had earned it, it struck something deep inside me. My mother came closer first, her hand reaching for mine. The same gesture she'd made hundreds of times before. But this time I didn't move. I let her hand hover. "We brought back some souvenirs," she said brightly, dumping a small bag of trinkets on the counter. Postcards. A few small crafts. Tiny things that spoke of care but didn't include me. "Mom," I said quietly. "Where's Mark?" A small, almost imperceptible shift passed over her face. She cleared her throat. "He joined us, dear. It was all last minute, but we thought he needed it." I nodded slowly, not because I understood but because I had no other reaction. I could feel the tension building like the quiet before a storm. The air in the room felt heavier than the luggage stacked by the door. They looked at me like they expected questions, maybe gratitude. Instead, I just watched. Mark came in then, carrying a small backpack and a towel draped over his shoulder. He smiled at me the way someone might smile at a stranger, unsure of how to bridge a gap they didn't realize existed. "Hey sis," he said lightly. "Missed me?" I shook my head. "Not really," I said, the words flat but honest. Mark's eyebrows shot up, not in hurt exactly but in surprise. He wasn't used to hearing the truth. No one was. He looked to my parents and I saw their expression falter for the first time. My father cleared his throat. "Sarah, well, we thought it would be nice for him to." "I see," I interrupted, steady and calm. No yelling, no tears. Just clarity. I felt my own heartbeat in my ears. Every cell in my body seemed to recognize the moment I'd been preparing for without knowing it. I was no longer the backup, no longer the quiet safety net. I was simply myself. They didn't know what to do with that. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. My father shifted from foot to foot. Mark looked between us all. his charm useless against the quiet certainty I now carried. I moved to the kitchen counter, picked up one of the postcards and examined it. It showed a sunset I would never see in person. "Nice trip," I said. The words weren't sarcastic. They weren't bitter. They were simply true. A moment of honesty that hung in the air, weighty enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Mark muttered something under his breath, and my mother shot him a look, a silent reprimand. I didn't acknowledge it. Instead, I continued unpacking the souvenirs, carefully placing them back in the bag. I didn't need them to represent anything for me. They were theirs, not mine. Dinner that night was strange. We sat around the table in the same room where countless family meals had taken place, but the energy was different. I cooked quietly while they told stories about the cruise. Laughter came from my parents, but it sounded hollow to me. I noticed small details I'd ignored before. The way my father's hand shook slightly as he gestured, how my mother kept glancing at Mark when she spoke, as though to measure his response. I ate slowly, savoring the food, letting the normalcy of the act contrast with the abnormal tension in the room. They expected gratitude. They expected conversation. I gave them only observation. The silence was its own statement. Later, as we cleared the table, my father tried to engage me directly. "So, did you want to go next time?" I set down a plate and looked at him straight in the eye. "Maybe. But it won't be because I'm expected to." The words hit harder than I anticipated. I could see the flicker of realization pass through their expressions. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Mark's eyes widened, the easy smile gone. They had always assumed my compliance was automatic. They had always assumed my approval was a given. That assumption ended tonight. After dinner, I excused myself to the living room, carrying a cup of tea. I sat on the couch, feeling the fabric against my skin, and allowed myself to breathe. The weight I had carried for decades, the expectation, the unspoken obligation, the quiet acceptance of being second choice, began to lift. I felt an unfamiliar sense of space inside me. Not emptiness exactly, but room. Mark came in later carrying a book. He tried to make small talk, asking about my day, my work, casual things he never bothered with before. I answered politely, but the warmth wasn't there. I could see him calculating, trying to measure how to navigate this new dynamic. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone else, but I felt it. My parents joined us, carrying snacks from the kitchen. They sat down, pretending everything was normal, filling the room with chatter about meals, ports, and sunrises. I listened, noting how they still overlooked my presence while expecting me to be entertained by their stories. I let them speak, nodded occasionally, but inside I was keeping track, not of the storylines but of myself. I realized in a quiet, powerful moment that they had expected me to pick up right where I left off, to laugh when they laughed, to praise Mark for his participation, to act as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I wasn't invisible anymore, but I wasn't their audience either. I was separate and they had to notice it. Later that night, when the house had quieted, I went into my bedroom and closed the door. I could hear the faint hum of their TV in the other room. The way they had expected me to adjust to their return, to smooth over the imbalance, no longer mattered. I allowed myself a small smile, the kind that comes from recognition, not relief. In that quiet, I began to plan small changes. Not grand gestures, not confrontations, but boundaries. Decisions about what I would say, what I would accept, what I would no longer manage for their comfort. The first steps were simple. Letting the conversation end without me trying to patch it. Observing instead of accommodating. Speaking only when I truly had something to say. And then unexpectedly my father peeked into my room. He didn't come in, just leaned against the frame. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, keeping my voice calm. "I'm fine." He hesitated, then nodded back, leaving without another word. That single interaction spoke volumes. No pressure. No pleading. No attempt to demand gratitude. Just observation. And for the first time I noticed the balance had subtly shifted. The next morning their routine was the same. Breakfast, coffee, chatter about the day ahead. But I moved through it differently. I poured my own coffee. I prepared my own breakfast. I didn't ask about their plans. I simply acknowledged their presence, neutral, detached, calm. I saw the flicker of frustration in my mother's eyes when she noticed I wasn't seeking connection, and I allowed it. I wasn't responsible for making their comfort my own. Over the next few days, I maintained this quiet stance. They tried repeatedly to draw me in. Stories, jokes, even Mark's attempts at camaraderie. I engaged politely, but my heart remained distant. Every request to smile, every expectation of warmth, every small attempt to involve me met the same calm, steady observation. I began to notice subtle changes in their behavior. My mother stopped talking over me. My father measured his words more carefully. Mark started pausing before speaking, unsure if I would respond the way he expected. Nothing explosive. Nothing dramatic. Just a shift. A ripple that slowly reshaped the room. By the time the week ended, I felt a quiet victory. Not a triumphant one. Not one filled with gloating or revenge. Just clarity. Recognition. I had made it clear, without raising my voice, that my world had boundaries they could no longer assume I would cross. I stood at the window one evening, watching the sun dip behind the trees. Inside, my parents laughed softly at something Mark said. I let them enjoy it. I didn't feel bitterness or anger. I felt separation, space, and strength. The world had not ended because I refused to be invisible, and for the first time I realized that my presence or absence mattered because I chose it, not because they dictated it. The house felt different. Familiar, yes, but not familiar in the way that demanded my subservience. I moved through it like someone testing newly discovered freedom, aware of each step, aware of the new balance. And for the first time, I understood what it meant to return to the same space, same people, and feel profoundly changed. That week, they expected the old Sarah, the accommodating daughter who smoothed every ripple. Instead, they encountered someone present, aware, and quietly unyielding. And in that subtle, steady transformation, I realized that the gift I had given them, my trust, my care, my loyalty, would no longer be unquestioned. I would decide when and how to give it. The moment they came back, expecting everything to be the same, I learned something crucial. The world does not have to bend for those who once overlooked you. And in that lesson, I found a power I had never allowed myself to claim before. After the first few days of their return, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in decades. I didn't need to fix anything. Not my parents. Not Mark. Not the invisible threads of obligation I had once carried silently on my shoulders. The clarity didn't come like a sudden revelation or a dramatic confrontation. It came slowly, like the morning sun stretching across my living room floor, gentle, deliberate, impossible to ignore. I spent that first morning alone, sitting at the window with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm. Outside, the neighborhood moved quietly. A dog barking at the mailbox, a mail truck rattling past, the distant hum of a lawn mower. Inside, my house felt calm in a way it hadn't before. No subtle tension pulling at me. No need to interpret every glance or tone. Just space. I realized that in those quiet moments, I was finally free to exist on my own terms. For the first time, I made a choice that wasn't dictated by history or expectation. I decided to go for a walk. Not to run errands. Not to check on anyone. Just to walk. The cool January air brushed against my cheeks as I wandered the block, observing neighbors gathering leaves or sweeping porches. For once, I didn't care if anyone noticed me. The freedom to simply be was intoxicating. I thought about what freedom meant for me. Not the absence of responsibility exactly, but the absence of manipulation and favoritism. I realized that I had spent years anticipating the needs and moods of others, while quietly burying my own. My parents, whether consciously or unconsciously, had conditioned me to adjust my presence, my voice, my desires to make room for Mark. That conditioning wasn't cruelty, it was habit, but it had cost me pieces of myself. Now, standing on a corner watching a neighbor push a child on a swing, I felt those pieces slowly returning. Returning home, I opened a notebook I'd been keeping since they left. This time, I didn't write about frustrations or injustices. I wrote plans for myself, small, achievable things that prioritized my happiness. I wrote about spending mornings in the garden, even if it got messy. I wrote about reading books I'd shelved for years. About cooking without concern for criticism. About saying no to things that no longer fit my life. Every word felt like an assertion of independence, an internal declaration that I mattered. That evening, Mark knocked on my door. I heard him hesitate before speaking. "Hey, Sarah. You doing okay?" His voice carried an awkwardness I hadn't heard before. He wasn't used to me being separate, calm, unresponsive to his usual charms. I opened the door just enough to nod. "I'm fine," I said. He shifted as if testing the ground. I wanted to apologize if I stopped him with a gentle hand. Not in anger, not in hostility, but in quiet clarity. "Mark, it's not about apologies. It's about boundaries. We're learning them now." He blinked, clearly thrown. "Boundaries?" "Yes. Mine. Yours. Everyone's." He didn't argue. He didn't charm. He left with a quiet nod, carrying with him the realization that the Sarah he knew, the one who would smooth over any conflict or lift burdens that weren't hers, no longer existed in that same way. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle shifts everywhere. My parents, initially oblivious, began to tread lightly around me. My mother, always eager to share stories, would pause and ask if I wanted to listen. My father, who had been practical and efficient to the point of being distant, started including me in decisions, but no longer expecting me to acquiesce blindly. Even Mark began to observe, learning that my engagement required my willingness, not habit. I spent time reflecting on past sacrifices that felt necessary at the time but now seemed like lessons disguised as chores. I remembered helping my father file taxes when I had a deadline for work. I remembered covering for Mark when he skipped responsibilities, quietly explaining away his failures. I realized that those moments had shaped me, but they didn't define me. I was more than a caretaker, more than a buffer, more than a backup. One afternoon, I went through old letters tucked away in a drawer. Some were from relatives, others from friends long gone. One in particular caught my attention, a note from a former coworker who had once told me, "You always give, Sarah, but you never take. Don't forget to save something for yourself." I had read it before, dismissed it as advice for young adults. Now, decades later, it felt prophetic. I was finally learning to save things for myself. I began organizing my daily routine with a deliberate focus on personal growth. Mornings were spent in the garden or walking. Afternoons were for writing and cooking. Evenings for quiet reflection or reading. I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. Each moment spent in my own rhythm reinforced the clarity I had gained. My life was mine to shape. One weekend, my parents invited me to dinner casually. I agreed, but I chose the time, the location, and the tone. At the restaurant, I observed them as they talked about the cruise. I listened politely, but I didn't volunteer anecdotes or praise unless I genuinely felt it. Their expressions shifted. Slightly surprised, perhaps unsettled, but I didn't flinch. I allowed the silence that followed questions to be real. That night on the drive home, I reflected on the subtle victories of the past weeks. No dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches, no ultimatums. Just quiet assertion, the kind that changes dynamics without spectacle. I realized that stepping away emotionally and physically, when necessary, was not abandonment. It was respect for myself. I began reconnecting with friends I had neglected while tending to family expectations. I had coffee with Joanne and shared openly about my experiences. For the first time in years, I didn't filter my words to soothe anyone else. Her laughter, her nods of understanding, reminded me that relationships could be reciprocal, grounded in respect rather than obligation. In my home, I made small changes that symbolized this shift. I rearranged furniture for comfort rather than tradition. I placed photographs of myself on shelves where they had once been absent. I lit candles for quiet evenings and allowed the house to reflect my presence, not the expectation of others. Each act was minor, but collectively they reinforced a larger truth. I was here for myself first. One evening, my parents came to check on me. They wanted to talk, to reconnect. I listened. I spoke minimally. And I realized that their need for reassurance was not mine to fulfill. I didn't harbor hatred for them. I didn't need to punish. I simply exercised clarity. I could be present without losing myself in their needs. I walked past the living room later that night and saw Mark scrolling on his phone. He looked up briefly, caught my gaze, and lowered it quickly. No words passed. I felt no tension. No need for confrontation. Our dynamic had shifted quietly without drama, yet permanently. He understood, if only subconsciously, that I would no longer exist merely as a buffer or shadow. The following morning, I sat by the window writing in my notebook. I wrote about the lessons learned, about self-respect, about recognizing one's worth, about letting go without bitterness. I realized that clarity was its own form of empowerment, more potent than anger, more lasting than resentment. It was steady, enduring, and deeply satisfying. I took a long walk through the neighborhood that day, noticing small joys I had ignored for years. A neighbor's child running with a kite, the way sunlight reflected on the icy branches of trees, the smell of baking bread from a nearby house. Each observation reinforced the simple truth that life was rich, not because of others' approval, but because of awareness and presence. Later that week, I prepared dinner for myself without expectation or performance. I set the table, lit a candle, and ate slowly, savoring every bite. The meal was not for anyone else, not to earn praise or validation. It was for me. That act, so ordinary and small, felt monumental. It was the embodiment of walking away, not with anger but with clarity, with dignity, with peace. Even when my parents or Mark tried to draw me back into old patterns, I felt grounded. No frustration. No resentment. Just recognition and calm boundaries. I realized that stepping back allowed them to confront themselves subtly without confrontation. They were learning too, though imperfectly. And that was not my responsibility to fix. One evening I visited my garden. Snow had begun to fall lightly, coating the edges of the flower beds. I knelt in the soft powder, feeling the cold through my gloves, tending to plants I had almost forgotten. Each movement was deliberate, each breath conscious. I felt connected to life in a way I hadn't for decades. This was clarity. This was my own space, my own rhythm, my own life reclaimed. I thought about the journey from the first moment of betrayal to now. The shock, the quiet anger, the restrained confrontations, the subtle shifts, and the final clarity. It hadn't been about punishment. It hadn't been about revenge. It had been about discovering myself, about realizing that love and care could exist, even in families, without losing oneself. By the time my parents left again, it wasn't with tears, drama, or fights. It was with understanding, quiet and unspoken, that things had changed. I had not vilified them, but I had redefined my place. I walked away, not in the physical sense but in the emotional and spiritual sense, from old expectations. I carried nothing but the knowledge that I could protect my peace while still allowing care and presence. As the evening settled in, I sat on my porch with a warm blanket, watching the horizon glow with the last light of day. The world felt steady, quiet, and full. I thought about the road ahead. I thought about future interactions with my parents, with Mark, with anyone who expected me to bend. I felt equipped, strong, centered. Walking away without hatred, I realized, wasn't about anger or absence. It was about choosing clarity, choosing dignity, choosing the space to live life fully on one's own terms. I smiled softly, feeling a peace that had been foreign for far too long. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was, what I wanted, and what I would no longer tolerate.